Coming.
Okay, so a little bit about Megan, who is our guest host today. She is the Assistant Education Director at a leading civil rights organization where she implements anti-bias and positive school climate initiatives at K through 12 schools. She's a really great person to help us with this conversation. And prior to this, she had worked at the Skirball Cultural Center, developing year-long teacher training programs. So she's got a decade of leading theater for social justice with young individuals, and that led her into a career of training educators in arts integration, culturally competent curriculum, and anti-bias teaching. That is a mouthful. That is hard to say. And she's really passionate about guiding participants through self-reflective work of anti-racism and building the skills to disrupt systemic racism in every facet of life. So without further ado, Megan, take it away. As you can see, if you aren't familiar already, my name is Tanya Guardino. I run the marketing here at Scoot. And on the call, we also have Kevin. Kevin's been with us since the very beginning of the company as well. Kevin, go ahead and say hi.
Hello, guys. I am Kevin, and as you see, I'm a senior education consultant, and I work primarily with partnerships. So I'm excited to be on this call. And as Tanya said, I've been here pretty much since the company has been around. And I'm really excited that we are moving in this direction just to have meaningful conversations around seemingly difficult topics. That is it for me. And I did know that there were a few questions simply because we are monitoring the webinar, the chat, as well as the Q&A. And so I see that there were people who had questions about the workbook. Or the just so you know, it is case sensitive, and so if we can go back to just so that they can click on it or put it in the chat or browser, just let you know it is case sensitive. So make sure that you capitalize the S and the B on Scoop Book, or you can click in the chat where Tanya just put and just click and it'll come right up. So either type in the bit.ly or click on the link that Tanya posted in the webinar chat. And James is back.
Right. Well, James, we're ready to go. Why don't you give Megan the green light?
Okay. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, everyone. My
back.
computer decided that was the perfect moment to completely shut down and restart itself. So I'm sure that everyone filled in for me very ably, but I'll, if we skip ahead, did you guys do the introductions or am I doing the introduction?
Yeah, we did it.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Well then, everyone, thank you so much for joining. I'll just very quickly say that even in a very short session that I had with Megan yesterday to prepare for this webinar, she made me question so many things about my own thought process, my own behavior, my own language that I use in just a very short session with her yesterday. Shorter than what we're going to have now. And it has been, so just that short period was highly impactful and educational for me. So we are very, very lucky to have Megan as a part of this. And I think, I hope that everyone really takes the lessons that we all learn to heart. Because this is very important work and it can be confronting work. It has been for me, but it's worth putting in the effort so that we can have a better community. So without further ado, here's Megan.
James, that is the most wonderful, flattering, honorary, like just my entire goal in life is to ask people to think critically and do it in a loving way. And so I just think that is like that's the biggest compliment anyone can ever give. So it's a lot of big shoes to fill for myself. So thank you. And so let's get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining me for this special webinar with Scoot Education. I've actually known Tanya since the 6th grade. So We go way back, and I'm really grateful to her for bringing me on board to support you all as you move towards an anti-racist teaching practice. And I can't see all of your faces, so I'm not sure what identities and communities are represented amongst you all tonight. But you might be wondering why a white woman is leading a webinar on anti-racism. And that's a really good question. That's a really valuable question. As a white anti-racist educator myself, I believe strongly in the power of white and white passing people supporting one another on a path towards anti-racism. This country was founded on racism through the stealing of land and the attempted genocide of Native American and First Nations peoples, and the use of chattel slavery of Black Africans to build our American economy. And the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, really woke a whole community of people up to see all the ways in which this country systematically oppresses the Black community. And in my own work, I build spaces for white identifying people to unpack their own experiences in messy and complex ways so that communities of color are not burdened with having to constantly educate. So we can and should do the work on ourselves, follow the lead of people of color, and engage in the daily practice of anti-racism. And this session today is just an introduction. We cannot solve 401 years of oppression in 1 hour, but this will be a collection of nuggets that you can take and immediately put into your practice or share with colleagues who could benefit from this exploration. So figure out what works best for you. We don't know until we try. And as we're going along, I ask that you make a note of when you might feel uncomfortable with the information presented. And I want you to ask how that discomfort is created by our various identities. So am I feeling uncomfortable because as a cisgender woman, I am supposed to remain quiet and not cause disruption? Am I feeling uncomfortable because I feel and I really believe that I treat everyone the same? So know for yourself, and then dig in and do some research to figure out where that feeling comes from and how you can address it. So how will we all address this today? This big question of moving towards anti-racism. And what information and tools will you receive to help you move in that direction? First, you have received a workbook, as we talked about earlier, that can be used during and after this webinar. So the first section has questions and prompts to help you put this information into your own words and to encourage you to do some research to find other examples of racism in education. I always tell people that we don't know how to talk about something until we try. So it is really important to put these ideas and concepts into words that match our voices so that when you inevitably need to explain them, you know what you can say. And the second part guides you through a process of self-reflection and action planning. So you can move through the questions on your own time, and I hope they make you think, dig deep, and provide some clarity on where you can go next. And finally, the last section is a series of resources, all working links, to support you in this work. So in this hour, we're gonna cover a lot. So we're gonna move through all of this information, and it might feel really overwhelming, and you might walk away being like, whoa, I just learned so much. This is so challenging. But my hope is that you will review this information later and start and kind of feel your own empowerment to dig in and explore even deeper. So what we're gonna do today is we're in the welcome and introductions. We will begin by reviewing some language and terminology that help us understand why this work matters. I will share some research related to how racism can show up in young people, teachers, and the education system as a whole. We could spend 5 years discussing this research, so I will share with you a few key facts that I hope will elevate the urgency of this work. And then I will share some concrete ways to build an anti-racist practice, strategies you can use immediately when confronted with racist remarks and behavior, and finally, ways that you can support your colleagues of color in this fight. And we will close with an opportunity for you to submit questions through the chat, and then myself, along with our Scoot hosts, will engage in a dialogue. So let's jump in. And before we dive in, there's a few kind of guiding assumptions that I want us to use as we move through this conversation. So first, we are all here to become better. We are never perfect, and there's always work to do. So by being at this webinar, I will assume that we all understand that we can and should work to be better educators and better human beings. And that begins by agreeing that we all have bias. It is impossible to grow up in this world and not form biases. And we will talk later about what bias can look like, but we all have it. And those biases that we form throughout our life lead us to all have prejudice. It is a fog that we have been breathing in our whole lives. And prejudice is learned, therefore it can be challenged. We are all capable of unlearning, and it will take more than just one webinar or even a few years to unlearn all of the prejudice that has been ingrained in us. And finally, I will assume that we will all take responsibility for ourselves. So we will practice responsible risk, share what you feel comfortable sharing, but also take a pause and a breath before hitting send to make sure that what you're about to say is really what you mean. So with that, we will dive into the first section of this webinar, language and terminology. So first, I'm going to ask you, we're going to send out a poll for you all to complete with a few statements, and I'd like you to pick which one is true for you. So James, if we can get that poll going.
Yep, that should be on the screen now, Megan.
Great.
And I see some results coming in. We're at 80%, Megan.
Great.
So we might give it 10 more seconds or so.
Okay, great. So it looks like no one in this space is just not going to address the issue of race or racism at all. And there's something I would like to kind of take a moment to address. And, you know, I hoped that I addressed it in the beginning, but I think it's important to address again right now. So why am I the one talking about this? As someone who does anti-racist work with white people, you know, my intention with this webinar is really for this to be for folks who are more on the white identifying end of the spectrum. And if that does not match your identity, I encourage you to think about how you might share this information. How can this webinar be something that you send out to folks who have a differing identity from yours, so that you don't feel the burden of constantly having to educate. So this information is really intended and kind of targeted towards people who are more on the light skin of privilege, more white. But I hope that there are a little bit of nuggets that you can take with you from this. So I just wanted to address that ahead of time, but it's totally valid. We are very comfortable talking about race and racism. That is fabulous. I love hearing that, but I also see that we're sometimes uncomfortable and we're sometimes comfortable. And what I want to acknowledge is that oftentimes it really depends on the situation you're in and who you're talking to. So there might be one person in my life where I feel like I can really challenge them. And then there might be other instances where I don't feel like this person is really going to listen to me. So I think we move in and out of this idea of comfort or ability in very fluid ways. So with that said, what is anti-racism? So this term has suddenly become a part of the lexicon with the current movement, this current movement for Black lives. And what does it actually mean and what does it look like? Well, to understand anti-racism, we really need to understand racism. And again, if this is knowledge you already know, wonderful, beautiful, I love that. If this is new for you, that is exciting as well. So racism is defined as the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. So those of us who identify as white, we were taught growing up that racism is a racist act by an individual. Therefore, as long as we didn't say or do anything explicitly racist, it had nothing to do with us. But the truth is that racism is a through line in American history and is a complex social system created by humans that is upheld in all of our institutions. And in the United States, our institutions are particularly anti-Black, but they marginalize and oppress all people of color in different and complex ways. And racism shows up in all aspects of our lives and society, in how we communicate with one another, through discriminatory policies and practices, and in our laws and institutions. And there are 3 levels that help us to really understand how we interact with, contribute to, experience, and perpetuate racism. So these are 3 that as we move through, I want you to think about how they build upon one another, that systemic and structural racism cannot exist without the interpersonal racism and the racial biases that people carry. So interpersonal racism, what is this? This is how we've been socialized through experience, lessons from people in our lives, and from the media to make assumptions based on race. It can look like how we speak to one person versus another because of their racial identity, or biased language or comments used about or towards a person of color. And at the center of the discussions happening nationwide is systemic racism, also known as institutional racism. And that is one that operates through the policies, procedures, and practices of the institutions in our society. So these are the systems and factors that determine who does or does not have access and opportunity based on race. Examples of systemic racism can include crime laws that target communities of color. We're going to look at more examples in a little bit, but it's really the decisions that get made by people in power that affect entire groups of people. And then we have structural racism, which is how interpersonal and systemic institutional come together. So it is the cumulative impact of interpersonal and institutional racism within our society. It's what happens when all of these various systems and policies interact with one another. So here are a few examples of what that might look like. So I encourage you to look at them. What I always find so, I don't want to say shocking, because I think white people often say that, oh, this is so shocking. How could this be happening? But the ways in which the systems come together to impact people's lives in structural ways tells us a lot. So this structure that's been built over the course of 401 years is called white supremacy. So we often think of white supremacy as white supremacists, but it's really the name for this structure that was designed and created in order to oppress people of color, and originally Black people. And it is at the root of every institution. And a significant result of racism, and something that Scoot really wanted me to address, is the presence of colorism within communities of color. So it's defined as differential treatment based on skin color, especially favoritism towards those with a lighter skin tone, and mistreatment or exclusion of those with a darker skin tone, typically among those of the same racial group or identity. But it can really play a role in the interactions between people of color from different racial or ethnic identities. And we wanted to bring this up because a lot of stories were shared with me of, if a Black educator goes into a classroom that's mostly Latinx students, there might be some challenges that come up because of that. And that's an example of colorism. And Lupita Nyong'o called colorism the daughter of racism, which I think is a really powerful way to think about it. So question is, what role do our biases play in the upholding of white supremacy and racism in America? A very important bias to understand is that of implicit bias. So implicit bias is the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes and unintentional actions, positive or negative, towards members of a group merely because of their membership in that group. So it's really all the ways that we have been taught to view groups of people, either through the media that we've consumed, the explicit messages shared with us by family or friends, or the ways in which systems have been designed to give us messages we might not be aware we're receiving. So for example, there is an overrepresentation of Black men in violence in the media. So because of this messaging that I as a white person have been ingesting over the course of my life, I might move to the other side of the street when I see a Black person walking towards me without even realizing it. So implicit bias, this is something that is unaware, involuntary, and unintentional. And explicit bias is the exact opposite. And all studies show that most often our implicit biases are in direct contradiction with our explicit beliefs. I am a firmly anti-racist person. I engage in this work in all of my professional capacities, and I still catch my implicit biases coming up. We have been raised to see racism as purely explicit, or those of us who are white, we have been raised that way. So when in truth, implicit racism constantly shows up in our thinking and behavior. And one of the ways that implicit biases related to racism show up is in the idea of being colorblind. And I'll be honest, I most often have heard the term colorblind being used by teachers. So this is an important thing for us to think about. Now, the idea of being colorblind implies not seeing race, which is impossible. It erases racial identity, which is the most powerful social identity in the United States. It is a refusal to acknowledge a person's life experience and generational history. And at its root, the idea of being colorblind is intended to keep us from challenging a racist system. So when we say, I treat everyone the same, or it doesn't matter if you're Black, white, blue, or purple, our intention might be good. We might think that what we're saying is that I won't treat you differently, but the impact is the opposite. The impact could be that someone feels like you don't see them at all, and you're not someone that they can share their authentic self with. So this brings me to my next point, and something we talk a lot about in this work, intent versus impact. So intent versus impact is the idea that, and the belief that the impact of a word, phrase, action, or behavior on a person is more important than the intention behind that word, phrase, action, or behavior. Because the truth is, no matter what someone intends, harm was done. And that harm needs to be acknowledged and dealt with in a really healthy way. So here's some tips on how to respond if the impact does not meet the intention. Listen, pause, and breathe. If you haven't, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility is a wonderful resource on how to deal with and engage with these situations. Acknowledge and apologize for the harm, and then share you'll do the work to change behavior or language. So this is the difference between saying, I'm sorry you were offended, versus I'm sorry that I offended you. So really taking ownership of the impact that even though you didn't mean to do that, harm still happened. So these are some ways that you can respond that I have found really helpful. So as I mentioned before, the structure of racism in this country is called white supremacy. And what we see at the top of this pyramid is how we've been taught to think of racism in the US as individual acts committed by explicitly racist people. But as we've already discussed, that line isn't that explicit or overt. Instead, there are so many things that get said, done, or supported that keep the structure of white supremacy operating smoothly and as designed. When we look at the pyramid as a whole, we see all the ways that we can participate without even being aware of it. And we often think of the binary of racist or not racist, and that you are one or the other, but I'd like us to think differently about this. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi redefines racist for us as someone who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. So it's fluid. We move in and out of racism through what we do or intentionally not do. And it is defined by our actions rather than who we are as a people. Racist is a very triggering word, especially for white people, because it feels like a value judgment on me as a human being. And that's because we think of ourselves as not racist, which in thinking of our fluid engagement is actually a denial of the role we play in the American system of racism. Saying we're not racist alleviates any responsibility we have to making our society more equitable and more inclusive. And kind of the term anti-racist really comes from this wonderful quote from Angela Davis. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So what is that? This is Kendi's definition again. This is from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So being anti-racist as a white person means engaging in the deep personal work of examining how I have benefited from a system of racism, what messages I need to unlearn that have been ingrained in me by my environment since birth, and how my inaction has upheld the status quo. And I think the part of this definition that strikes me the most, and I hope, we're not going to talk about it, but I hope you can percolate on it, is the idea that no racial group needs developing. So I want you to think about that. So we're going to dive into the next section, which is what racism and anti-racism look like in practice. So what does racism look like in learning spaces? How is this specific to the education system? So some stats from studies about young people. As early as 3 months, babies start to notice differences in skin color. They start to look more for faces that are the same race as their caregiver. So they're noticing these differences even at 3 months. And by ages 2 to 4, children internalize racial bias. By 5, they start to make judgments and decisions based on race. So who they play with on the playground, who they decide to wave to, who they feel comfortable making eye contact with. And studies show that children of color exhibit a pro-white preference by age 6. So there's a really famous study where children were asked to choose which doll they wanted to play with. And most often, the kids of color chose the white doll. So this messaging is being internalized and showing up in the ways that they engage. In terms of teachers, there's some new studies that have come out that share that teachers' racial biases tend to influence the expectations they have for their students, their quality of teaching, and their classroom management. And a study in 2018 found that pre-service teachers graded the performance of a student who appeared to have a migrant background statistically significantly worse than that of a student without a migrant background. White teachers are less likely to place Black students in gifted education classes. And white teachers are more likely to give exclusionary discipline or suspensions and detentions to Black students. There's a really famous study that tracked the eye movement of teachers when watching a video of preschool students play. They were prompted to keep an eye on bad behavior, and the tracking showed that teachers were more focused on the young Black male student than of their other students. So even our implicit racial biases can cause us to look for things that aren't there. And teachers are more likely to rely on their racial biases when a decision is ambiguous or they are tired. So our implicit biases are really there to help us make quick second decisions. But the problem is that our implicit biases are formed by an oppressive society. So when we are stressed, tired, or unsure of what to do in a moment, we can easily and unintentionally revert to our racial biases. And the education system. I mean, we really could, you could do whole PhD programs just on studying this. So I'm just going to these are a few facts that I think really point to this issue. And as educators who often work at schools in many different parts of LA, you have probably noticed major discrepancies amongst the schools, whether it's in the quality of learning materials, the number of students on free or reduced lunch, the physical state that a school is in. Not all schools are treated the same. So for example, despite the passing of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, schools remain segregated, and studies are actually showing that we have reverted almost all the way back to what schools were like before 1954. And this is happening for many different reasons, but one is how schools get state and federal funding. So, oh, whoa, sorry, y'all. Oh, you got to see those pictures that are coming up. So the cycle of funding keeps schools under-resourced. In case you didn't know, schools get funding based on their test scores, but students in underfunded schools don't have the same access to updated books, to technology, to honors classes, and to fully credentialed teachers as schools that are in affluent areas. And additionally, the needs of students living near the poverty line are drastically different, and schools rarely have the resources to address those needs that keep students from being able to fully engage in their learning. So for example, school districts serving larger populations of Black, Latinx, and Native American students receive $1,800 less per student than those serving white students. This can end up being a $9 million difference in funding between schools. And discipline is a huge issue when it comes to racial bias in education. Black students make up 18% of all preschoolers, but represent almost 50% of preschool suspensions, whereas white students make up 43% of all preschoolers and only 26% of preschool suspensions. And when Black and white students commit similar infractions, Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended and expelled. So discipline is a really important space to interrogate the racial biases of adults, as studies show that the severity of suggested disciplinary actions were increased when the race of the teachers didn't match that of the child. And this is an especially important topic right now due to the conversation around police and communities of color. So schools that serve primarily students of color often have police officers on campus. And it is imperative to understand that responding to a child with a police officer not only calls upon centuries of history of police violence, but also worsens that child's relationship to their school. We have heard too many stories and seen too many videos of preschoolers in handcuffs or teenage students pulled from a chair and thrown to the ground. So this is an important topic. So I'm going to show you some photos. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this or did see this, but a textbook in Texas. So this was a textbook that went out to all students, all schools. It included slavery in the immigration section, and it described slaves as workers that were brought over to the United States. So right there, we're seeing how racial bias is showing up in the ways in which history is being told in textbooks. And then here's an example. These were some teachers who, these 2 photos are from the same school. These are some teachers who dressed up as Mexicans and also as the border wall. And I will say that there's at this school in particular, there's a significant Latinx population. So you can imagine what the impact of these costumes were on those students. And additionally, this was a photo that went viral of some teachers posing with a rope noose. And it didn't occur to them what that noose means in the history of racism in the US. So these are the things that students are seeing and experiencing when they're at school. So how can I begin to put anti-racism into practice? What does that look like? First, engage in your own ongoing education. Read books written by authors of color. Read books written by anti-racist white authors that kind of help you unpack the whiteness in this country and the white experience. Follow people of color on social media that challenge your thinking. My recommendations are Kendriana Speaks, Rachel Cargill, and Layla F. Saad. These women and what they share out for all of us to receive shakes me up every day. And it's important. Watch films and television shows that decenter whiteness and center stories of people of color. Take stock of moments when your privilege is serving you, whatever that privilege might be. Acknowledge when your biases show up and immediately address them. And then if there's any terms or ideas or concept studies that you're more interested in from this presentation, I encourage you to Google it and do some of your own research. This is very specifically for anyone who is white on this call. It is imperative to see and acknowledge color in the room, including your own. So this really goes against that whole colorblind theory, right? My experience being a white educator in spaces predominantly students of color has been that if I am transparent and immediately address the fact that I am white, and we talk about what that means, what they think that means, what my body means to them and their experience, we're able to move into a conversation rather than if I just walk in and pretend like I look the same as them and they're not noticing that I am a white person. So I have sometimes used humor to kind of engage in that dialogue, but it is really important to not pretend like color doesn't exist in the room. Another thing, accept that the long history of racism behind your interactions might make your lesson unsuccessful. And that's okay. Initiate challenging conversations about race if comments are being made that point to difference. Pause, breathe, and remember that your actions can either disrupt or perpetuate the system of racism, and choose which one you're willing to do in that moment. It's also important to note that pronouncing students' names correctly is critical. Ask a student how they pronounce their name and make sure to repeat it and pronounce it correctly. Another thing, move from a deficit model to a cultural wealth model. So this is something that was put forth by a wonderful researcher named Tara J. Yasso, who writes beautiful work. And you know, we as white people, we were taught to view people of color in a deficit model rather than acknowledging what each student brings to the classroom from their life experience. So Tara's cultural wealth model shifts the lens away from a deficit view of communities of color as places full of cultural poverty, disadvantages, and instead focuses on and learns from the array of cultural knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts possessed by socially marginalized groups that often go unrecognized and unacknowledged. So in addition, I'm gonna show you the cultural wealth model quickly, but additionally, do the internal work to identify how your expectations about a student might be defined by their racial identity. So this is just a quick, I encourage you to look this up. You know, aspirational capital, familial capital, social capital, navigational, resistant, linguistic. You know, these are all the things that you can think about in terms of what students are bringing from their life experience and their own histories. And it really shifts your thinking about what a student is capable of and kind of what you hope that they'll do. Decolonize and diversify curriculum. Now I understand that there's different levels of doing this as a substitute. You might be in the room one day and you might find out 5 minutes before that you need to go to this school, or you might have a more long-term placement. So I hope that some of the tips that I give, you can start to think about what this might look like for you when you're only there for a day, kind of how can you shift questions that you might ask, or if you're there for more long-term, what that would look like. So first, begin by diversifying your own library of resources. Students learn best when they see themselves represented in what they're learning. So identify resources such as books, historical figures, video clips, questions you can have in your back pocket if a lesson is not culturally relevant to the students. So if the lesson that you're handed, you're starting to notice that kids are not engaging because it's so far from their life experience. What is a little bit of knowledge that you can bring in that might help them connect better? Shift questions to be more inclusive and tap into the cultural knowledge in the room. And in long-term placements, you might be able to shift lessons to utilize different modalities of learning that don't privilege the traditional Eurocentric form of teaching. So by incorporating diverse figures, marginalized histories and narratives, and discussions about identity, oppression, and resistance. Demilitarize classroom management and discipline. So this is kind of a little bit of what we talked about in terms of the stats earlier. Find out if the school has a school resource officer, a sworn police officer, or security guard on campus that handles disciplinary issues. Pause and breathe and think about your identity in relation to the student. Use the breath to keep from relying on implicit bias, and think through what potential impact your discipline can have on a student. And remember that trauma is often at the root of disruptive behavior. I am not an expert in restorative justice, although I think restorative justice is utterly incredible and I wish all schools would use it. And I'm also not an expert in conflict resolution. So I can't tell you how to handle a situation that turns physical, but I encourage you to always think about what your actions say to a student based on the identities present in the relationship. Initiate a discussion to break down the feelings or behavior in the room, and engage the school counselor if necessary. So I want to pause for a second to do a chat box check-in. So I will, James, can you change it so that they're going to respond to all? I'm having
Yes.
a problem. I'm having a hard time seeing the.
That's been done, Megan. So
Okay, great. There's the chat. Perfect.
Yeah, and so if people will be able to share within the chat box now.
Okay, perfect. So I would love for you to identify an area that you will commit to learning more about and improving in your own teaching practice. So what we went over was your own education, acknowledging color in the room, moving from a deficit to a cultural wealth model, decolonizing curriculum, and demilitarizing discipline. So if you want to identify what you want to kind of learn a little bit more about and put it in the chat, and then we can all see where we're at. I know we're running out of time here. We started a little late, so. My own education, yes. Decolonize, yes. Cultural wealth models. Educating myself. Great.
Megan, we had one question about where you showed a triangle chart about white supremacy, and we did have one question about where that chart came from, if you can remember.
Yeah, it's from a anti-racist organization. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. It gets sent around a lot. And there's that kind of pyramid idea is used in a lot of organizations. So ADL has the pyramid of hate, which looks at bias and bigotry on a bigger scale. But I'm happy to find the name of that organization and send it out.
We've also had a couple of questions about asking people a couple of people who have asked the exact definition of what Latinx means.
Oh,
do you mind addressing that?
Great question. Yeah. So within and I will say Latinx, within the Latinx community, there is a push to make it gender inclusive. So instead of saying Latino, Latina, unless someone wants to identify themselves that way, there is a shift in language so that when one is referring to that community as a whole, we say Latinx. And there's really interesting conversations about why one should say Latinx instead of Hispanic, because the word Hispanic is really rooted in a colonial history and privileges the white Spanish piece of Latin America. So that's what Latinx means.
Thank you.
Also, my Zoom chat just froze, so I can't see it.
Okay, well, perhaps we should continue with the presentation. And there's just a couple more slides, and then we can open up for a discussion in the short time that we have left.
Perfect. All right. So how can I challenge racism when I see or hear it? I would love to do this next poll question, James. So if we can put this up. Do we have the other poll?
Sorry, that's coming up now.
Okay, great.
Here we go. Sorry, it was a bit tricky. Sorry, there's a very specific drop-down icon that I needed to find that I could not find.
We're all learning. We're all learning.
Sorry about that, but the poll is up now and results are flooding in.
Great.
A few people saying they can't find the poll. If you can't find, we'll keep it up for another 10 seconds or so. You might just have to move around the different windows because it does come up as a separate window. So if you can't find the poll, try seeing that. But, oh yes, and if you're on the phone, the poll is going to be a challenge.
Oh yeah.
But I think we will.
But this looks good.
Okay, so I'll share.
And if people want to continue responding, great. So it looks like in a general sense, most folks agree that they feel comfortable challenging racism when they see or hear it. But also there's a significant portion of folks who don't feel comfortable. And so that's what these next slides are to help you do. So thank you for responding. And I also want to acknowledge that responding to colleagues, especially if you're a substitute, can be really tricky. So I ask that you do what feels best for you, but setting your own anti-racist boundaries allows for others to set their boundaries, and also for a school climate to begin to change. Also, challenging bigoted responses models that practice for students and adults. Studies show actually that it's always better to say something, even if it comes out messy, if it feels like it doesn't work. It's always better to say something than not say anything at all. And there's no prescribed response or protocol for responding to a racist or other bigoted comment. But there's 4 things that are important to think about and assess when you experience something or you hear something. Time, space, audience, and power dynamics. So how much time do you have to deal with this moment? Do you have 10 seconds in a class that you need to kind of shut something down and then move on? Or can you pause and take a few minutes to really discuss? Where are you? Are you in a public or private space? Who are you responding to and who is around you? What identities are at play? And what are the power dynamics? Are you the adult and the teacher in the room? Is it the principal that made the comment? Because that's a very different power dynamic. And also power in terms of identities. So am I a white man responding to a Black woman or a Black female student? Am I a Black teacher responding to a classroom of white affluent students? Think about power and what impact that power dynamic might have on the situation. And then you can determine kind of what is your best course of action. So it's important to remember, especially for those of us who have the privileged identity and whatever the interaction is, that just because we feel uncomfortable, that's not the same as being in danger. But if one of your own identities is being personally targeted, your response might look very different. So determine for yourself if you have the emotional capacity and the physical safety to confront the person. So these are a few strategies that I have found really helpful and that I use in a lot of my training with students and teachers and schools. A quick one is ouch. Oh, that hurt. Kind of lets someone know that what they've said was painful. Hey, I don't think that's an appropriate thing to say about teachers or students, etc. So if you hear a teacher make a comment in a public space or when they're talking to you, you can just say, I don't think that's appropriate. In the classroom, you can say, we don't use that kind of language in this classroom. My favorite is to ask questions to really get to the root of what someone is saying. So this is not an example about racism, but my fiance is a high school teacher, and he was in a classroom and he said something about a movie, and a student said, oh, that movie's so gay, I don't want to watch it. And he said, huh, I didn't realize that. Are there gay characters? I said, no. Is it a gay storyline? No. Is it address gay themes? No, mister, it's just stupid. Oh, that's what we're talking about. So let's talk about why we don't use the word gay to describe something as stupid and where that comes from. And one of my colleagues that I love often says that if someone realizes that a joke doesn't land, they're not going to tell that joke again. So if someone makes a racist joke and you go, I don't get it, what does that mean? They might not ever say that joke again because it didn't land and they didn't get the reaction that they were looking for. Another thing you might say is, I was really hurt by that statement. Can I share with you why? And another one is, are you open to feedback about what you said? That helps you determine whether this person actually will engage with you or not. So I would love for you to think about, and actually it's in your workbook, but I would love for you to think about a strategy that you would like to try. I can't see the chat right now, but if you would like to put in the chat which one that you want to try, and so everyone can see, that would be great.
Megan, if you can't see the chat, are you able to see the Q&A?
Yes.
Okay, great, good. So we'll be able to address some of those questions when we have time.
Yes. There's some good ones in here. So just identify for yourself, and there's a part in the workbook where you can pick which ones you want to use. What's happening here? Okay. So here are some strategies on how to best support your colleagues of color, because that is another really important principle to anti-racism, that you're not just doing your own work to work on yourself, but you're also doing the work to make it a better environment and a more equitable environment for the people around you. So these are indirect and direct ways to support your colleagues of color. First, do research to answer your own questions. Wait, what happened here? Oh, sorry, y'all. It was weird. We're having technical difficulties. Do research to answer your own questions rather than relying on Black and other people of color to educate you. Introduce inclusive curriculum materials that can shift school culture, and learn about the school and how it values diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI. So either work with Scoot to find out this information, or you can do your own research to find out how the school handles discrimination complaints. Does a school penalize a student without education and healing of harm? Is there a student court that recommends discipline? Is there a DEI person at the district level who can provide some oversight or pressure? And suggest and advocate for anti-racist professional development, either as a long-term substitute in a school or from Scoot. I encourage you to ask Scoot to do things for you. And, establish or join a racial affinity or anti-racist group in or outside of a school. So if you are at a school for a long period of time, you can, take the initiative to start a group with other teachers. You can ask for Scoot to set that up. You can do it through the educators that you're connecting with through Scoot, or just the people in your life. So really having that support and the community to do the work and dive in. And some direct ways to support your colleagues of color is to leverage your own power and privilege. Use your voice to uplift and elevate others. So this means leveraging our power means to use our collective social privileges to give access, visibility, and power to more marginalized groups and individuals. So in a moment when a colleague of color is being ignored, silenced, or mistreated in some way, we must break white solidarity to challenge biased behaviors. Share the space that our privilege inherently allows us to have. Build relationships with educators who do and do not look like you. Make sure that these relationships are rooted in anti-racism. Provide anti-racist support and education to other educators who look like you. How can you do the work so that your colleagues of color don't always have to do the emotional and mental labor of advocating for their own humanity? And take accountability for harmful impact through spoken recognition, authentic apology, and turning words into actions. Take initiative and request what you need to become better and what an organization or a school needs to become better. And don't be afraid to have difficult conversations. And to help you feel prepared to have these conversations with your peers and students, here are a few resources that you can dive into right after this call. You can watch 13th on Netflix. I also recommend anything related to Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative on HBO. You can read, so you want to talk about race. I also saw a comment about why white fragility is such a great resource, and asking if Scoot can hold some kind, maybe a book club or something for that. Legally, I don't think that you can provide a PDF, but white fragility is a critical resource for white people to understand how we respond to our own whiteness and racism. I saw Robin DiAngelo speak, and I felt so called out constantly, and I feel like I learned so much. So white fragility is a really, really, really good resource. The National Museum of African American History and Culture has a really interactive resource online called Talking About Race. Deep historical information, wonderful questions for self-reflection, ways to engage in this work as a teacher. And then Teaching Tolerance has really great lesson plans and webinars that you can join. A children's book that addresses police violence and racism is called Something Happened in Our Town. And then the 1619 Project through the New York Times Magazine has an amazing podcast that really breaks down what all of this looks like at the institutional level and how it affects people on the personal individual level. So those are some resources, and those are listed in the workbook. They are immediately useful and will help you along this journey. And so I want to leave you with a quote from Maya Angelou that really helps guide me in my own work. It's on the wall of the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, which looks at slavery to mass incarceration. And it is a wonderful reminder of why this work is important. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So I'm going to end it there. We did a lot of talking. So I'm going to hand it over to James and Kevin, and we will get to have a short discussion.
Thank you, Megan. Appreciate your presentation very much. A couple of quick housekeeping, well, not quick housekeeping, but a couple of points that I'll go through quickly. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Megan. But although before you do that, I'll point out that Megan's contact details, it looks like her social media account as well as her email address is displayed on the screen now. I'm sure she would be very happy to hear from anyone on this call with feedback, questions, or just to start a dialogue. So please take that down. So a couple of things from us, because I want to get to, in the short, we're not going to take up too much of everyone's time, but I do want to get to some discussion points. A couple of quick things. If you are a substitute teacher with us, not everyone knows, we opened this presentation up to anyone, not just employees of Scoot Education. So if you're not familiar with what we do, we're a company that works with educators to place them into new schools when they're looking for a new career opportunity. We also employ substitute teachers or guest teachers, as some schools call them, and help fill day-to-day and long-term vacancies with the substitutes that we employ. If you are an employee with us, you have access to a handbook. If you don't remember what the URL or where to find that handbook is, it's on the next slide that Megan will show in just a moment. But please do reflect on that. If you ever find yourself in a tricky situation, it includes tons of very useful information. It also provides contact details. If you have experienced some form of discrimination or harassment or racism in your work with Scoot Education, and that means directly with our team within the office, or if you've experienced those matters in a school while working with us, please contact your education consultant. That's the person you work with most often. If that person is not available or you don't feel comfortable taking that to your education consultant, then the contact details are in your employee handbook of the independent people to go to should you want to raise a experience situation if you've witnessed racism, discrimination, harassment in the workplace during your work with us. So again, on the screen is where that handbook can be found, but also please do speak out if you see or if you witness or experience something. Kev, do you want to talk about the next slide and the diversity page on our website and the various initiatives? Which Megan will flip to in just a moment.
Hi guys, so as I don't know when you guys came in, I am Kevin. I have been a part of Scoot Education pretty much since its inception. I had been speaking with our team, and we are continuously growing and understanding all stakeholders. And it became very important that everyone was represented equally in thought-provoking conversations. And so that I can say that James made it a point as the CEO and leader of this organization to ensure that all voices who are a part of Scoot Education are heard. And so, and we did change pretty much the format because we did see a lot of questions coming in from education of color, specifically Black educators, and understandably so. This presentation was truly geared and catered to educators who do not identify as Black or people or educators of color, just to give more of an insight on how to approach the students that you're dealing with day to day. And so I did want to just allow you guys to see right here on this page. I don't have to read it or go through it. It's just some of the initiatives that we are moving towards and some things that we're doing to just address systemic injustices, specifically catered to people of color, Black people, as an organization. And right now, moving forward, we did want to just allow this time and moving to a Q&A. Because we've seen many questions, but we did want to open the floor to anyone who has questions for Megan, anything that wasn't addressed. And I saw that there have been questions from educators who don't identify as color, who have had experiences where they felt ostracized, where they felt attacked in classrooms and didn't know how to respond accordingly. And so what I want just people at this time to just, if you don't mind in the Q&A or the chat, just post questions that you may have, and we want to look at answering those and being thoughtful of your time. And so we're going to try to not necessarily expedite it, but be intentional as we are continuing the conversation.
Kevin, I'm going to take away the first question because we were pretty sure we were going to get this. Megan, the question is, I am called a racist in class often because I'm white and I work in mostly schools with students of color. I don't take it personally, but how does one address this?
We knew that this would come up. I'm going to be honest. Can I be honest? Students of color, anyone of color, cannot be racist towards a white person. We might experience prejudice. Someone might make assumptions about me based on my racial identity, but my power in this country does not shift or change because of that comment. But it can be hurtful. So I want to acknowledge that it might hurt in the moment. It might feel uncomfortable. You might not know what to do. I don't have a prescribed answer. But I do think that if you are able to be in a long-term placement at a school like that, to find ways to build relationships is really critical. If you're only there for a day and you have a group of students for 45 minutes, honestly, there's only so much we can do. But as I said, when I have gone into spaces, my first time in a group with students of color, I have had a discussion about my identity with them and what that means. And that breaks down that initial barrier so that it doesn't seem like I'm just this unaware white person walking into a room. And I think it's important to acknowledge the history that is underneath these interactions, and that you are walking into the effects of over 400 years of oppression that was created and perpetuated by bodies and skin that looks like mine. So that's I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's my answer.
Megan, can you also speak to, I think you might have briefly touched on it, but around the fact that an educator in a classroom, despite what hurtful or racist words might be said, what is the educator's obligation in those moments to be a teacher?
I mean, the role of a teacher is to care for students, right? That is the role. And if in those 45 minutes, you can start to break down where those feelings are coming from and why, and maybe what their experiences have been that have led these students to have that immediate reaction as soon as you walk into the room, I think that can go a long way. But I think, as I said, the role of an educator is first and foremost to care for students. And so whatever you can do in that moment to acknowledge the feelings that are in the room, I think that is the first thing.
And I might add that in the workbook there is some of the techniques that Megan reviewed earlier in the presentation. They're in the workbook, and they're very useful, powerful techniques to use if you do find yourself in that situation that was in the question. You know, if you're a white educator in a predominantly non-white classroom, and I would encourage you to review those techniques and use them to see how that changes the situation.
I'm seeing a couple questions. Is it okay if I just
Please do.
pull a few out?
Yep, please.
I think this question of, is racism and prejudice ever exclusive of each other? I think that's a really important one. They can be. Yes, they can be separated from one another, because prejudice can exist about anything, about anyone. Whether or not that prejudice contributes and perpetuates a system of racism depends on who is enacting it, whose prejudice it is, and who it's towards. So I think that's a really interesting question. And there's another one: could there be a level of racism before personal, namely the intrapersonal, how you process personal experiences and the conversations you have with yourself? Yeah, I think that is the deep personal work that we have to do. Those are the things that we really internalize as human beings walking around in this world. And those internalized messages look very different based on who you are and what your racial identity is. And it's true for all identities, right? So I internalize a lot of messages about women as a woman. And I think of myself in ways that support a system of misogyny and sexism. And I have to daily challenge that and recognize the moments when I am expressing an idea that actually serves to further oppress women So there is that, I love that, that intrapersonal, so the ways that we internalize the messages that we receive. I think that's a really good question.
Megan, while you're reviewing, I did want to bring up one of the comments that came in the chat, which it's moving really fast. I'm trying to find it. One of our participants said, as a substitute or guest teacher, you are there for a short period of time, and they, the students, can spot people who don't care about them. That is such a accurate, good. It's such an important point. And for all of our substitutes who are on the presentation, I really want, if you could take that to heart, your impact that you have as a substitute will, and the success that you have as a substitute will be amplified enormously. So just, you are there for a short period of time. And if you show that you care about those students, it makes a huge difference. So I really implore you, when you're working as a substitute, walking into the school for the first time, maybe walking into the classroom for the first time, really keep that in mind. Megan, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We still have quite a few people on the call. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to address everyone's questions. There's just too many. Perhaps we could pick a couple more and then close out.
I think this question, there's a question of what are the do's and don'ts of humor as a tool. So they wrote that questioning what that student meant by gay brought to mind use of humor to lower guard. Humor can be very patronizing and condescending if someone doesn't know you. So I think that's an important note. Like if I had, there's certain ways of using humor that I'm, may or may not use based on how well I know a group or what our identities are in relation to one another. But I say that I often use humor by following the direction of the group. So if students are making, I'll tell you, I'll be honest, Tanya can tell you this is true. I crack white people jokes constantly. I don't know, maybe it's a self-deprecating humor tactic. But if students are moving in a direction towards humor, I might find a way to engage in that is respectful. But I don't think that humor is always the right tool to use. I think it's, again, that assessing who you are, who your audience is, what the engagement has been so far. And then if you try a little bit of humor and it doesn't work, that is not the tool to use. So there's a question of, if you hear a black and white students directing racial slurs to each other, do you report the incident to an administrator if you do not have the time to address it yourself? As someone who works for an organization that responds to school incidents, whether they're kind of general of there's the use of the N-word a lot by students who are not Black on this campus, or there is a specific incident that has happened and we need help, it is so important that administration knows what's going on a campus, because most of the time they do not. Most of the time there are deep racial tensions, issues around LGBTQ students and their safety on campus that administration is not privy to. So in whatever way that you can kind of let an administrator know that you're noticing these things, I think you can determine whether or not you would name those students. But the likelihood is that the Black student would be penalized much stronger than the white student. So we need to be aware of those identities, what the identities are, and how they might be treated at the school. But I do think it's important for administration to know if you notice something going on. This is not a question, but I love this. This was submitted as a comment. I am a person of color. I work with another agency, and I was at work today, and another student of color was extremely disrespectful in calling me the N-word. I had to simply redirect the student by telling him that the language is disrespectful, and reminded the student that I am there to support and help educate him. And, you know, the N-word is a really interesting topic because, you know, it's this conversation of who do words belong to? That is not a word that belongs to me. I can't tell a Black person whether or not they can use it. But if there's a school rule around the use of that word, you know, in the classroom, I might say, I understand, and you know, however you use that word outside of the space is up to you. But in this classroom, we don't use that. We don't use that language. So you can always fall back on whatever school rules there are. But that is a conversation that I would not feel comfortable having as a white person, because that's not my word or conversation to have.
Megan, maybe we could do one last one and then we'll finish.
Let's see. How should one respond as a substitute when students complain of other racist teachers at school or racism they feel on a daily basis? I think that goes back to how can you care for that student in that moment? That is first and foremost. Ask them what they're comfortable sharing with you. And, you know, you can say that, ask them if you would like them to share non-identifying information with the administration so that they understand what's going on. They might say yes, they might say no, but I think first and foremost, it's caring for that student in that moment. And I also think I encourage you to use Scoot as a resource, as an organization that is connected to these schools. You know, I would encourage Scoot to, if someone came and said, wow, students are really complaining about racism being exhibited by teachers, you know, Scoot could have a conversation with that administration. And, you know, there's a lot of wonderful training programs that schools can bring in to work with teachers. So that might be a route that a school could take.
Yeah, to elaborate on that answer, Megan is 100% right about that. If you you know, one of the unique things about working with Scoot Education is that if you're a substitute with us, or even if you're a permanent candidate with us, you have a consultant who is available to you, and it's their job to work with you, to learn about your experiences in the classroom, to learn about what you want to do with your career as a substitute or full-time teacher. So please use your education consultant as a resource, because we also have really strong relationships with schools, and we also see a really wide variety, a real cross-section of what's happening across many hundreds of different schools. So we do know ways of how to address things that come up with administration. So please use your education consultant as a resource. And if there's a situation where you're not comfortable going to the education consultant, please go to the employee handbook. There are people who you can contact that are not your education consultant. Go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, I just want to, there's one comment that I think is really powerfully points to why this work is so critical for white people to do to help disrupt this system that we created. And I just kind of want to paraphrase, maybe read it exactly, a little bit of it, just to kind of point to why, as white educators that go into spaces where there are students and people of color, that we need to be having these conversations. And then we can end there. Is that okay?
Yep.
All right. So someone said, one of the biggest issues and frustrations and stressors about racism is that it isn't in our heads or the heads of those children. We are the arbiters of what racism is. As a child with almost all white teachers, I was keenly aware of which were racist towards me versus which were not. It is not in the kids' imagination. You always need to do the work to figure out what you might be doing. These days, people worry much more about the label of racist versus non-racist, whereas all white people are exhibit racism and anti-Blackness. We participate, whether we want to or not, whether it's intentional or not, whether it's implicit, explicit, we are participating, and we are living in this society that we created, and it is on us to dismantle it so that something new can be created. And it's not going to happen in our lifetime, but we can work towards that future. And so that is what I care very deeply about. That is what my work is about. And I hope that you gain some resources from this that help you move in that direction. So thank you to the person who shared that. That is deeply important for us to understand. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you for attending. Kevin, Tanya, Megan, thank you for organizing this and facilitating today. Have a lovely evening and be well.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Great day, evening, and day.